Hi, I'm Scott Young, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy. Now, for this episode, I was fully prepared to offer an episode from the vault, my earlier conversation with Scott H. Young, the author of Ultra Learning. But Scott and I were able to connect for a live stream that we shared with members of my Time Crafting Trust Premium community, and we turned this into an entire episode to replace the one that we would have re-aired. So this is a fresh new conversation with Scott, who is the author of the new book, Get Better at Anything. So if you're listening to this as the episode is released, this book has just been out for just a couple of weeks at this point. Now, Scott and I, we discussed the research-backed approach to his continuous learning, which comes up in this book, the 12 maxims. We get into those a little bit. We didn't want to spoil too much of the book, of course. But we also talk about the idea of variability in practice, acquiring and learning from mental models, how to improve even complex skills that you've been practicing for years, and so much more. Scott shares some fascinating case studies from fields like aviation, chess, and more to illustrate the principles of learning. So whether you want to get better at your hobbies, career, or just living an examined life, this discussion, well, it provides valuable insights on the science and art of self-improvement. We also took questions from the audience. So this is a great episode, a fun episode, one that I didn't expect to deliver, but here we go. My conversation with Scott Young, and a productive one at that. Enjoy. Scott, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today on A Productive Conversation. I'm excited for those that are listening to this as it drops. We do have a live stream version of this episode, which has like some raw material and stuff. If you want to learn more about where we live, feel free to join us there. We have people, that are members of my Time Crafting Trust community that are in the chat right now. I will be looking for questions. If anyone has any questions, they want to chime in on the conversation. If you're here live, feel free to ask. And that way, you can take part in this conversation as we talk primarily about Scott's new book and some of the subject matter inside of it. 12 Maxims for Mastery. The title is Get Better at Anything. 12 Maxims for Mastery. Scott, it's great to see, it's been a while since you published your last, so did you have to get better at writing a book before you could write this one? Is that what it was?
Well, it was a different book. You know, you were joking about Jim Gaffigan before, but I always think of the comedian. Louis C.K. had this thing where he talked about how he was like really stuck as a comedian for a number of years because he just was working on the same set. And he heard some advice that George Carlin, because he would do these HBO specials, would like do a special and then throw out all his material in the garbage and start from scratch like every single year, and how like terrifying and difficult that was. But that was what led him to be a better comedian. And I felt a little bit like that going into the second book, because the first book was kind of like my life for like over a decade. Like it was every single idea and thought I had, I put it into that book. And for the second book, it was like, oh, what do I write about? And so I ended up, we were saying, like, basically since I wrote that last book to now, I had just been reading and researching, and I really wanted to write a different kind of book, write a book that was going to go into much deeper into a lot of the fundamental research, the science, really try to explain how learning works and break that down into practical advice. Because I mean, I don't expect the average person is going to want to read all the academic textbooks I did. So some things that I thought would be useful to people if you're trying to get better at anything. If I can plug the book title one more time.
I think the other thing is that it's weird because when I literally just got the book not too long ago, been going through it. We're going to talk about some of the maxims and some of the things that really stood out. But it almost feels like, was this a call to action regarding ultra learning, in that ultra learning was kind of like, here's how you do it. And you're like, but does it simplify it maybe? When I say simplify it, you know what I mean? Does it, like, it almost feels like, how Star Wars movies, the first trilogy is no longer the first trilogy anymore. And now there's like the new trilogy, and it's like, okay, well, let's look at, like, does it matter which order they read your body of work in at this point? Or is it kind of like, that's something that was fascinating to me as I was kind of looking at this.
Yeah, they're definitely not done so like you have to read ultra learning before you read this book. You can read them in any order. But I think to me, they're both like different perspectives on the issue. So ultra learning was very much driven from like, I had done these very intensive self-directed learning projects. So like some of them in my early 20s, the MIT challenge, learning MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum over 12 months. That was the thing that brought me a lot of attention. I did a project learning multiple languages. And I also knew a lot of people who were in this kind of community, sort of loosely connected group of people who were doing super intense like autodidact kind of projects where they're like, launching their own computer game and doing all the art, music, and programming themselves, or getting really good at like hyper-specific skills. And so in some ways, it was a kind of fairly peculiar vantage point on the question of learning. Like I was just looking at these sort of weird, intense people and like using that as the basis for like deriving some principles. So this book, I would say, had a bit of a different vantage point. And the vantage point and the thing that kind of got me started looking at it was focusing on not just individuals and how, remarkable people learn something particularly well, but on how different systems, different environments, different situations can either foster learning or make it harder. And what from that we can derive is like, these are the principles that work kind of everywhere.
Right.
And so the story that really got me excited about reading this book was actually Tetris, that I'd encountered this video by John Green, and he was talking about Tetris players because the game came out in like the late 80s, early 90s, and people were obsessed with it. Like there's op-eds being written about how people are like hallucinating falling blocks.
Did you see the movie, the Apple TV Plus movie that they did?
I did so much research that when I was watching the trailer, I was like, oh, I know all about this because I'd read
my son and I loved it.
I don't
mean to, again, we got a lot of time here. So I love having like the organic aspect, like, cause we watched that movie and the just fascinating story. So if you haven't, we'll put this in the show notes. But
Tetris, the creation of Tetris is wild because it's like you've got this engineer in the Soviet Union, and then it's like all this. You've got like there's a lot of cloak and dagger. And
it made the Game Boy.
It's crazy,
it literally made the Game Boy. Like so anyway, sorry. Continue. You saw John Green's video.
Yeah. Well, so John Green, he posted this video, and I just thought it was fascinating because basically you have all these people who are obsessed with the game in the early 90s. It's the it game. And there are measures of performance. There's a score. We can see how good the top scores are. We can see how many levels people have gotten to. And if you compare that to what people are doing now, it's not even close. And the funny thing is that I wrote this chapter based on like sort of what the state of the art was a couple years ago. It takes a while to write these books. Mm-hmm. And it's gotten so much better even than in the time period that I written the last book. Like one of the stats that I think is crazy is that there was a long time where it was thought that you couldn't play past level 29.
Right.
Like that level 29 was like the pieces moved so fast, you couldn't easily move them from right to left all the way. So the game would just stop.
Yeah.
People have now played over level 200.
Well, and didn't somebody break it?
It's crazy.
I think someone broke it not too long ago. I think there was a video where somebody actually broke it. A kid.
It was like a 13-year-old kid. A 13-year-old kid was the first person to crash the game because I guess you go so far into the game that it starts glitching out.
Yep.
And there's like weird glitches patched to certain levels. So you will reach a point where like if you do the wrong thing or the right thing, he was trying to crash it. Yep. You do the right thing in the right moment, the game will just stop. Like you've broken it. And so he was the first person to do that. But the thing I thought was interesting was not about Tetris particularly, but what's the difference? Why, the game's super popular. Why are people so much better at it now? And why is like the curve of acceleration of people getting better at it so much higher now? And the explanation John Green provided, which I agree with, is that in the old days, if you wanted to get good at Tetris, you had like your brother's older friend and he knew like a technique and this kind of thing. But it was essentially this disconnected people who were all working at the game. And so if you look at what people were actually doing, they were doing lots of things that a 13-year-old kid starting today would never do. Like they would never do those things because they know better ways of doing it. And the reason why we have the internet, we have online play, we have people live streaming. Good techniques get transmitted, get shared. You can see tutorials for like the right way to play the game now is super weird. Like you hold the remote and you put your finger on it and you're like have a glove and you're doing this under. It's like it's crazy stuff that you would never figure out on your own. And so the thing that I thought was interesting, and it parallels a lot more serious and important cases in case people thinking I'm being frivolous here, is that the ability to learn from other people, the ability for knowledge to get transmitted within a domain is essential not just to learning as an individual, but to progress of the whole field. I link it back to chemistry and science. Like the main problem the alchemists had was not that they weren't scientific. It was because they insisted on using this like convoluted sort of secret message system for communicating their ideas. And so no one could really build on what other people were doing. Because if you tried to copy someone's recipe, even if you were really smart, and it didn't work, maybe you just copied it wrong.
Yeah.
And so this idea of being able to learn from people was the sort of first original story that I got me excited about this book, because it wasn't really about, some of these Tetris players are pretty incredible, but it wasn't about any individual. It was, what are the ingredients that you need to have to learn better, to make progress? And so I spent the rest of the, couple of years looking into fighter jet pilot training and science fiction authors and Renaissance painters and all sorts of domains to look at, again, what are the ingredients that we need to get better at things, and how do we make sure that we have them in our learning so that we can improve?
So this is going to deviate a little bit, but you mentioned all the research that you do, and before we hit record, we were saying, like, what do we want to talk about? We're going to talk about the book, but also things that I'm interested in. And one of the things I find challenging as a writer, and I've talked to Chris Bailey about this, I think I've even chatted with Cal about this a little bit too, is how do you know when to stop adding the stuff? Because if you're constantly, like, you would have had a lot of material to go through for this, right? Like, so when does the seeking, when do you decide, because that's also a part of getting better, is to decide when to call it, like, okay, these are the pieces that I'm adding, and then the others I'll either maybe use somewhere else down the line. Maybe they become supporting material to further support, and it's outside the book, because editing is going to be part of it. But this is even just during the writing process, like, because you could have literally, like, this book could have been, miles thicker with all of the examples you could have gotten. So when do you have something in your head, in mind, that says, okay, this is the boundary I'm setting for this, or is it a little bit more touchy, feely about it?
Is the question about how do you decide when you've done enough research, or is the question about, like, how do you decide when you've added enough in the writing process?
Ooh, it's actually probably a bit of both.
Okay.
So start with the first one, then move on to the second.
So I'll be a bit of an outlier here, because if you ask people for advice, they're always like, oh, people spend too much time researching, and you got to just get it on the paper and do this kind of thing. And I'm actually totally on the opposite end of that. I think, if you look at this genre of books, most people have done way too little research. Most people have read way too few things. They don't know the subject well enough. I mean, there are examples of the opposite, but they tend to be like academic experts who have, like, spent their entire lives researching the topic. And then, okay, maybe a few too many things, or you're a little bit too in the weeds with the esoteric arguments. But I've always felt like it shows when someone really, really has, that they have given you the tip of the iceberg, that there was another, like, you can tell when someone is like, you're telling me one story, but you had a dozen. Like, I can tell when I'm reading something. So that's my feeling about research, is that kind of the more the better. But in asking your question of how do you transition from researching to writing, because certainly there's often, a kind of undirected browsing stuff online that people call research, which is not, I would say, is not really research. And then there's the problem of, like, okay, you've got all this material, how the heck do you, like, put it into a book? Yeah. And so for me, there's a few things, but I think as you get practice, and as you read examples, and as you do write books yourself, you develop some intuitions about things. So one of the things for me is, I know when I'm introducing stuff, I'm going to need to have a few points. So, like, the basic structure is very common to a lot of nonfiction, is like, you want to have a story, you want to have some kind of research or history or concept, and then you want to have some practical takeaway. So I know I need those three pieces. So sometimes I'd have one of the pieces, but I wouldn't know what the other one is going to be yet. And so I just kind of, like, I can't write it yet. It's not ready. It's not ripe. And so I would be looking around. And so, I had a chapter I knew I wanted to talk about. There's all this interesting research on variability and practice. And I thought that was very interesting, but I didn't know what the chapter was going to be.
We're going to get to that chapter, because that's the one of the first things I bookmarked was that chapter, because I found it fascinating. But continue.
So the variability, I knew all this research, and the research is done in, like, the context of, like, people doing, psychology experiments. It's not the substance of it is not, like, extremely interesting on its own. Like, I can't spin a good story about, like, how they did an experiment or something. So it was also a search for, like, well, where is an area where this also applies. So I ended up looking through a few domains, but the one that ended up sticking was looking at jazz improvisation because it involves a lot of the same principles. And so you do this sort of deep dive into jazz improvisation to put it together. So sometimes there is that kind of process where like you know what you need, but you don't have it, and that's directing your research. But then when I'm writing, I think one thing I've become more sensitive to is the rhythm of writing and recognizing like you have to get a feel for this is too long, this is too complicated, I don't care, or I want something new. I think in a book, that was something I did with ultra learning. When I wrote that, I had modeled it off of deep work. So I was like, I'd never written a book before. I like deep work. How did he structure deep work? And Cal had kind of structured deep work. Like first half of the book is why, second half is how. So I thought that's a good model. I'll do the same thing. And I did the same thing. So I had a couple chapters where I was like going over this argument for why people should do this sort of intensive self-directed learning. And then as I wrote those chapters, then I wrote the how chapters, I realized, well, the why chapters really drag. They're kind of boring. Like it's the how is what everyone's interested in. Like you had me at the first chapter, so I don't need to be sold anymore. So I ended up compressing those down into one chapter. And that you have to kind of like, you write it and then you read it and you're like, well, I don't like this. This is boring. This is not exciting. This is not, moving me through. And so I think you got to have that kind of rhythm of like, you're telling the story and then like, okay, this story is getting too long, time to move to something else. Or like this chapter is getting too long, you got to move to something else. And so I think that pacing and the rhythm, I mean, it's one of the reasons why even if you do a lot of research, it can be hard to write like a 300-400 page book, just because you're always aware of, the audience's, you're not writing a textbook. You're not writing for like an academic audience who like, tell me more because, they're interested in all the details of this subject. So you have to kind of balance that rhythm and keep it mixed up, so they're like, okay, we've done enough on this and we got to move over. So I think those intuitions come from practice, but I think they also come from reading books and reading books that do it well and reading books that don't do it well. And then you read the book that doesn't do it well and you're like, I don't like that they're doing this. Make sure I don't do that in my own writing,
Really quickly, Edward's got a question we'll come to in a second, but I look as you're talking about the why to and the how to, I'm like, why didn't you call the book How to Get Better at Anything? Was it do you think it was I wonder if there's nuance in just get better at anything more than how to get better at anything. Like it's almost...
Well, How to Get Better at Anything is a longer title, so I prefer Get Better at Anything just out of length. The how-to is almost implicit in there. But I think we went through a lot of titles. The title for this book, I think, was a lot harder than Ultra Learning. I'd been kind of gifted that concept, and so I knew what the title of the book was going to be. With this one here, we went through a lot of iterations, and I liked Get Better at Anything. It was actually my editor who suggested it when we were brainstorming stuff. And I liked it because I think also one of the things I noticed with ultra learning was that it had a little bit of this, that sounds like maybe that's going to be really difficult or really hard. And I think it also raised these questions of like, well, can I even do that? Like that's super difficult. Can I even do that? And I think for Get Better at Anything, I think it really got down to this finer point of, whether or not you're going to be, Mozart on the piano or Steve Jobs in the boardroom or what have you, we can always get better.
Right.
And I think if you can make that focus on like, take wherever you're at and how do you get better and what do you need to get better, I think that reframes the conversation, because I think sometimes when we view things in these really grand terms where we're just focused on like, how can I be an investor like Warren Buffett or something? Then you end up kind of I think you get derailed. You get sucked into these conversations about like, well, is it even possible to be like Warren Buffett? And then everyone starts navel gazing about like talent and these kind of things. Whereas I think if you just focus on, okay, take wherever you're at. How do you do +1? How do you do +2? What's the right way to think about that? I just think it naturally focuses the topic. So I think a title and the framework you have for a book is very valuable, because it sets the space for like, what are the things I'm going to discuss? What's my viewpoint in discussing them? Why should you care as an audience? And so I really admire people who are really good at like framing those kinds of discussions. And there's a real art to it. I think if you read a book that's really good and has a really good framework, it can seem really simple, but there was probably a lot of bad frameworks that got thrown out to like get to that one.
Yeah, it's actually, and Tim in the chat says, he goes, Get Better is an instruction, so more motivating as opposed to how to. Like that's what he says.
Yeah.
And he put I think. So that's his. So again,
Yeah.
that open to interpretation. All right.
Mhm.
Edward has a question. If you would distill your book into the top 3 skills that would make you better at anything, what would they be and why?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. And it's actually one that I explore a little bit in the book. There's a lot of research talking about domain general versus domain specific skills. So the idea of a domain general skill is that this is just something that applies to everything.
Right.
And so, problem solving, creativity, these kinds of things. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence that there probably aren't a lot of domain general skills. There probably aren't a lot of skills which you just make you better at every single thing you're doing. Now, why, if I believe that, would I even write this book? And the reason is that there's a difference between, I think, a domain general skill and having a mental model of how something works.
Right.
So there's no advice I can give you that will make you just a better problem solver at everything. But I can tell you how people solve problems. And if you have the right mental model of how problem solving works, then that can help avoid strategies. Well, that can't work because it sort of violates the rules of problem solving. It's a little bit like knowing the laws of physics don't automatically make you good at engineering and robotics and all these other things. But if you know them, you kind of know what's possible, what's not possible. And so I think this is also something that I really try to do in this book is give people mental models.
Right.
Give people a picture of this is how learning works. Because if you have that mental model, and you have the right mental model, then you're going to be much more likely to invest effort that goes in the right way. So I mean, maybe this is a little pedantic, but the way I think about it is it's not about acquiring, you acquire these 3 skills and then you're going to be good at everything. There's probably some more general skills than others. I mean, reading is a super important skill that we usually learn in grade school, and they teach it to us for a reason. And I would argue that there's certain branches of academic skills that I've found very valuable for their mental models. But for me, I think an area that's often lacking because we don't teach it in school, because it's very rarely a subject that you're taught in high school, or even if you studied psychology, I mean, learning is often not a central topic. It's they spend a lot more time on Freud and, some of these other kinds of, other sorts of topics. I think having good mental models for how learning works, how skills work, and how those things interact, I think is very important. And so that's what I really try to do with this book. And so, yeah, if you're going to say what are the important mental models to acquire, well, I think one of them definitely would be learning and how learning works.
Right. Interestingly, you bring up mental models. First name that comes to mind, Shane Parrish, another well-known Canadian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, yeah.
No, so when people, first off, some people don't know what mental models are, out of the gate. But secondly, again, this actually ties in nicely to the idea of how do you know what to put in the book, right? When do you, because you can spend a lot of time studying and seeking and looking at mental models and get that confused with actually doing something with them, right? Does that make sense? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that I often say people spend a lot, we try to avoid, I want people to avoid doing productive instead of actually being productive, confusing activity with actually being productive. So how do you make sure that there's this ebb and flow between I'm taking mental models and I'm using them and applying them, as opposed to just saying, well, I know these, so because I know them and I'm aware of them, I can actually, that's all I really need to do.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of evidence from other subjects where people are trying to teach conceptual subjects. So all I mean by mental models really is just a kind of understanding of how something works.
Right.
So a mental model, there's actually a lot of research on mental models. You were mentioning Shane Parrish, but I mean, starting in the 1980s, there was a lot of interest in mental models. I even have a post on my website where I kind of talk about the science of it, because there's Philip Johnson Laird is one of the sort of preeminent researchers who spent a career studying this process. And it's just sort of, the idea is that when you're making a mental model, you kind of form, I don't want to use the word image because the word image is right, but you form kind of a structure of the thing that represents what you're thinking about. And because you have this little object in your head that's represented somehow, you could ask questions about it. So if you had a little like picture of an object, you could rotate it and like see whether it's the same as another thing. And so the idea of a mental model, as opposed to being like memorizing a fact or being able to do something with your muscles or something, like there's lots of different components. So mental models are a kind of understanding. It's how we understand things. And so I would say that a lot of what you have to do to acquire mental model is, first, someone has to point it out to you. Someone has to point out to you that there's this idea that's important.
Right.
But understanding the idea, I think, and to really take advantage of mental models, you need to see it in a lot of contexts. So someone needs to show you, okay, it applies here and here and here and here and here. And once you start to see it in a lot of different, superficially different contexts, then it kind of gains a better status of like, oh, this is a tool that I can take to different places. So I think that's part of it. And then I also think that you start integrating it into your practice by, okay, how do I apply this in this situation? And so I think you do need to see it in enough places before that's even possible. If I just tell you a mathematical formula for like the law of large numbers or something, and I say, well, as n increases, the, confidence intervals become smaller, and you're like, okay, yes, and you can write it down, but you don't understand it. But if I say something like, well, the law of large numbers basically means that if you want to know who's a better baseball player, it helps to look at, more games than fewer games, right? The person who wins a few games is going to be, that's a concrete example. Or if I talk about, you should trust studies that have more participants in them, or, you should trust polls that ask more people. And these are all different examples. And you're like, okay, I understand this general principle and I understand how it works. And so I think the same thing about like a book like this one, where I am introducing a number of important mental models that have been derived from research that I think are very fundamental to how learning works, is, I try to give stories, I try to give examples to get you started, but then you're going to hopefully apply it to yourself. So when I introduce this idea of working memory and how it like constrains how you can acquire skills, you can start to see it in your own skills that you're learning of like, oh, the difficulty here right now I have is that the working memory load is too high.
Right.
What can I do to alleviate that? So these are things that I think, the starting point is hearing about the idea, is seeing examples, but you need to apply it in a lot of different contexts for it to be an active part of your problem-solving toolkit.
Well, and it to your point about the working memory part, like that requires like pushing other things aside so you can get that kind of, you can free up bandwidth, for lack of a better term, right? So, all right, let's get into this variability. Like the first thing, when variability over repetition, because the first thing I thought of was, you hear so many times like doing something again and again and again and again makes you better at it, right? Like that's the, and I'm not saying that that's not true. Like, the 10,000 hours, which, there's a lot around that now as opposed to when Gladwell put it out. The Bruce Lee quote, the person that, I fear the man that does 10,000 punches the same as opposed to one, butchering that quote, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why? What does variability do that helps you get better at anything as opposed to just like the repetition? Like, there's got to be, I'm sure there's balance, but what do we, I think a lot like in productivity, we're going to get to quantity and quality too. But when it comes to productivity, this idea, we focus so heavily on the quantitative, that qualitative kind of gets cast aside. To me, it seems like repetition is the one like, hey, we got to do this again. But variability kind of gets cast aside as well. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think, going back to mental models of learning, I think it's very important to think like, what is happening in your brain when you practice something? What is improving? Because we tend to like speak about this in broad terms, like, oh, if you just practice something a lot, you'll get better. And I know you mentioned the 10,000 hour rule. I recently published a post on my website reviewing some research talking about why I think the 10,000 hour rule is just like a bad meme, like it's just not a good idea.
Yeah.
And the reason is not because practice isn't important, but because first of all, the research it was based on, Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice, very much did not say that just spending 10,000 hours doing something will make you world class. The whole phenomenon he was investigating is that most people, even people who do things for their professional lives, do not become really, really good at it. Like they do not become world class. So he invented this whole idea of deliberate practice in part to explain why some people seem to get really, really good and other people don't.
It's the quantitative
So
part, though. It's that, like, people want numbers. If they get numbers, they're
Yeah.
like, if I do this many times, then that.
It's a good meme.
It is, but
it's just misleading.
It's very it's got to frustrate the hell out of you when you see something like that.
Well, I mean, I think so. I think that's one thing. I think that this kind of idea that like is just racking up enough hours. You do need a lot of practice, but what is practice doing? Well, one of the things practice is doing is it's making whatever actions you're taking smoother and more automatic. So if I'm practicing a golf swing, I'm making the motion smoother. It's requiring less mental energy. I'm not thinking as much about where my swing is going, how I'm moving. I am maybe also tweaking and adapting it to different conditions. If, I'm taking a hit out of the sand pit, or if I'm, driving, I'm adjusting how I'm doing things. So practice is making this performance smoother, fluid, more automatic. Now, this has some great benefits and it also has some downsides. One of the great benefits of this kind of practice is you remove the mental effort. We were talking about working memory, another good concept, good mental model. As you remove the effort to perform a skill, you can free up your mind for other things. So a good example of this is reading. When you start to learn to read and you are just at the beginning part of recognizing the letters, it's excruciating to sound out every single word. But as you keep doing it, as you keep practicing, your brain develops specialized circuitry that will recognize the letters, associate them with the sounds, automatically suggest the word in your head. And this all happens unconsciously. You're not thinking about it at all. And that means that you have all this extra mental bandwidth to think about the meaning, think about whether you agree with the person or not, sometimes also to daydream. These kinds of things can go on as well. If you're driving a car, when you started driving a car, it was probably a very effortful, difficult task. You were not sure how to steer the wheel. Like, how much do I turn it to get the turn I want to get? How do I change lanes? It was probably a lot. But now you maybe can do it so well that when you're commuting, if you have to go to a different destination than you normally do, sometimes you accidentally go on your normal commute. Like, oh, shoot, I took that exit I wasn't supposed to, because you're not even thinking about what you're doing. So this is a general trend of practice, is that it makes skills smoother, more automatic. I know there's a quote which is, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. I don't know whether I would go so far as to agree with that, but it does suggest that like what you're doing is making something that was explicit, deliberate, effortful into something that's automatic. That's very good. The downside is that while we can improve through practice, I don't want to suggest that we just learn things very rigidly and we never make any improvements. Like you learn something one way and you just practice it identically time after time. But there's limits to how much you can change your skill just through repetition. So the example I like to raise is if you're typing on a keyboard and you learn to hunt and peck with your two fingers and you're looking at the keyboard and you're hunting and pecking, no amount of practice your entire life is going to turn that into touch typing. It's not like if you do it for 10,000 hours, all of a sudden you're going to be using all four fingers and doing it the way you should have been taught in typing class. And so there is a real sense that as you practice, as you do a lot, you are also ingraining in certain kinds of habits that will limit you maybe if you using the wrong method, the wrong technique, and you have to do something quite different. So what does variable practice do? Well, one of the things that I think, again, from this model of doing things is that often what we are doing when we're performing complicated skills is we're not just performing an action. We're not just, okay, I need to do this, but we're also deciding when we need to perform that action. And so there's a lot of research showing that if you do practice in fairly narrow, constrained circumstances, so, okay, we're going to do our layups, and you just practice layups again and again and again and again, you do get smoother and more fluent at practicing the layup. But one of the problems is that you don't develop this kind of control process of deciding, okay, this is when to do the layup. Right. This is the timing. This is when to do that. And that gets sort of underdeveloped. And so there's this concept called the paradox of transfer, which is that if you practice in a more variable environment, so you're doing your layup, but you're also doing 3-pointers and you're also doing free throws and you're doing it, where someone's also like, putting some pressure on you, so you have to shoot quickly and you're not just standing behind the line with no opponents there. If you have greater variability, learning will be slower. You will not acquire the layup pattern as fast. You will not acquire the free throw as fast as you would if you were explicitly focused on it in isolation. But you will develop more deeper, more abstract patterns. So if you learn a new skill or you learn in a new context, your learning tends to be faster. And so this shows that if you want a flexible skill, if you want to be able to perform something in a lot of different environments, variability in the practice is super important, because if you only practice in this sort of very narrow circumstances, you can have this illusion that you're getting really good at it, but then you go to apply it somewhere else and it's very difficult. And I think this is a real problem with school-based subjects, because how do they do it? Well, you do unit 1, and then you do unit 1 homework, which is the problems that come from unit 1. And you're like, maybe it's difficult, but you get it. And you're like, okay, you move on. And then you do unit 2 and unit 3, unit 4, and you pass the exam and the class went well. And you're like, okay, I aced it. And then you go to the real world and you go to the job and you're applying things that should have been from unit 3, but you don't apply it. You don't transfer it. And why don't you do that? Because you were learning it and practicing it in this very constrained set of environments, which makes it so that when you are in a very different environment, you're much less likely to apply those techniques, because you have not developed those control processes. You've not figured out what are the right places to do it.
It's so funny because as you're talking about this, I think about the static versus the dynamic, right? Like there's so many more. We try to make things that are going to be dynamic static as much as possible, because we like certainty. Like we like to know, like, okay, this, but once you involve other things, people, places, scenarios, I mean, I guess, even it, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, about, the push to get everybody back in the office, right? Like, let's get everybody back in the office. And it's like, this was never going to happen. Remote work was never, I'm like, I don't know. Remote work was happening. It just got accelerated by the conditions of what was going on, and it worked. And now it doesn't mean that it has to be that way permanently, to your point, but there is terms like hybrid, dynamic, nuance, like all those things. First off, they're very it's just the way, or the shades of gray, like black and white. No, it's the world operates in gray. And when you learn something, I mean, although I will tell you that kids hate it when you say, when you go into the real world, they're like, oh God, they roll their eyes, right? My daughter, I can't tell you how many times, well, when you get, you can't just roll in at this time. And being late, there's a good example. Like being late, you have agency over, right? Like that is something, but there are other elements, like when she goes and works at the coffee shop and she's like, I'm booked for these hours because that's what she's doing and she's getting ready for school. She knows that her static time to be there is from here to here, and then like from 9 to 5 or 9 to 2 or whatever, and that there's certain skills and certain things that she's going to, and she's actually really good at being a barista now, which is great. She's going to be going to Concordia in the fall in Montreal. So she's got all the skills of like serving, like she's going to do quite well. But the dynamic elements are the other people. Like, what are they going to order? How busy is it going to be? How does someone learn? Because when you're saying you can get better at anything, the dynamic elements are so important. How do we make sure that we don't ignore them and get so myopic that, because that's when someone picks up a book that's seems prescriptive, and when then they're like, oh, but this didn't work because of X. Like this chapter on variability, which is basically smack dab in the middle of the book. It kind of is like, hey, by the way, this matters. Like, how does someone get past that? Because we live in a world that doesn't like to promote that either.
Yeah. So when you're talking about dynamic skills and skills where you have unpredictable elements from the environment and it's continuous in time and it's interactive, it's funny you mentioned that because I have a whole chapter about it. So there's lots of topics. Everything you bring up, I can be like, guess what? It's in the book. But no, but I did a lot of research because this was I think a big concern. Definitely starting from like about the 1980s, there was a lot of people who were concerned that the way that psychologists were often doing these tests of human functioning, getting people to memorize lists and do these sort of very sterile problem solving in the laboratory, that they were not really dealing with how people actually think, because we are constantly in this feedback loop with the environment. We're constantly engaged with the environment. So there was a lot of thought about how does that work? And so I devote a whole chapter to talking about this in the context of pilot training, because pilots are in this, the man-machine interface or the human-machine interface is one where we are, you can't just learn to fly a plane by reading a textbook, quite obviously so, right?
Yeah.
You have to be up there in the plane. But it is also something which is very difficult to teach. Planes are very expensive. When you crash them, bad things happen. There's lots of constraints on this. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that, the military has, the US military has like funded a lot of psychological research because they really care about questions of training and this kind of stuff. Like they're spending, hundreds of millions of dollars on this plane and, tens of millions of dollars in this pilot training program. Like hiring a few psychologists for $100,000 to like figure out what's the best way to train them is like really cost effective. So we have all this like research that's been done on like Army training platforms. And so one of them in this pilot training domain, we have a lot of research on what works for training pilots. So one of the obvious things you can do is you can use a simulator, right? Simulators are cheaper than the actual plane, and you can get people in them. And what we find is that simulators are actually better than the plane at the beginning. So for the first, it depends on the situation, but the studies show that from about 10 to 20 flights, the simulator is actually better than being in the real plane, which might sound crazy, but simulators are not very realistic. They're heavy simplifications of being in the plane. And in the beginning, when you're trying to get the basic principles, a simpler situation that is less realistic is actually better. And I think that's an important point because sometimes we think, oh, well, we want to be in the plane right away, but actually it's not true. At the beginning, we're going to be better off in the simulator. However, it is the case that these things show a diminishing return. So after you've done enough, then you need to be in the real plane. And that's because there's going to be more and increasingly subtle features of the environment that you need to train your skill in, that you need to synchronize with. But another thing that's important, and this was a real realization that the aviation industry made, again, starting around like the 80s, 1970s, was that the focus had been on pilot skill. So I talk about how like the very early days of pilot training, there was a real focus on, the mechanical skill, the skill of navigating the aircraft. And there was a lot of work on doing that because, planes weren't very well built in the very early days. They were a new technology and people were crashing them all the time. And so there was a real focus on that. But flash forward, 60, 70 years, and people almost never crash planes because of mechanical failure. Like they almost never crash a plane because they're just like, oh no, and I steered it into this mountain. Like that almost never happens. The training is so good, but there's still accidents. And why are there accidents? It's because of the human element. It's because people don't listen to other people and the air traffic controller. And so I have a whole thing talking about one of the worst aviation disasters in history. And the guy who crashed the plane was the head pilot instructor for KLM. He had 10,000 hours of experience. He was one of the best pilots in the world. And he crashed the plane. Why? Because he was impatient. He was a bit arrogant. He decided that he wanted to take off and get off, even though it was foggy and he probably should have been following protocol. In other words, it was the system around him that needed to be improved, the system around him that needed to be adapted, not just the individual training experience. And so I think getting real world experience is important. And it's also important that when we're in this dynamical system, you're serving drinks at Starbucks, you're in this kind of thing. Often what emerges, the actual skill that you end up practicing is not what you learn in the classroom, not what you learn in the textbook, because there's all this accommodation. There's all this like, well, we have the standard operating procedures at Starbucks, but then in the actual shop, there's going to be different things happening because, oh yeah, that machine doesn't work. So you have to do it a different way and people adapt to it. And so I think this integration of practice and real world stuff, as much as people roll their eyes at real world, is very important because you can't get real skill in these dynamic environments if you're not actually practicing the real thing.
By the way, did you notice, I pointed this out in the chat, that when you were talking about like the diminishing, you went like this as if it was a plane that was crashing?
I'm doing, what's boring though is that I'm doing this and like maybe it's also the mirror version. I'm like looking at a mirrored version of myself. But for me, I'm like drawing a curve. Like that's how nerdy I am here. That I'm drawing like an asymptotic curve, and that's what I'm doing. And people, it's like,
are you left-handed or right-handed? Out of curiosity,
I'm right-handed.
You're right-handed.
I'm right-handed,
okay.
But I think. I don't know. For some reason,
that's your left. Yeah, I can see you're using your left.
But I think it's because I want to go up and to the right, but like in a diminishing curve. And
gotcha.
So I'm mentally drawing a graph that I would do with a pencil, but this is the wrong way if I'm looking at it. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions that I want to make sure I get to, but Tim, a member of Time Crafting Trust Committee, has another question, which I think is, actually, this is definitely one that I was going to get to. So I'm glad Tim addressed it. What is the hardest thing that you, Scott, has got better at. Why? And what was
Mm.
the secret for you to getting better at it? Now, I mean, you could say
Ooh.
all 12 are in there, I guess. But I mean, I'd love to hear.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
The hardest thing that I've gotten better at. I mean, oh man, that's almost like it's almost too difficult to list. I'm like trying to narrow it down here. I'm not going to say it's the hardest, but I do think it's one that I feel like has been a major factor for me is writing. And I know that sounds like funny to say because I write a lot, but I think it's almost because I write a lot that it has been harder to get better at writing. Like often I'll document learning these skills in this book where I'm doing something over a relatively short period of time. So for one thing, you're at that early part of the learning curve where there's like so much low hanging fruit. Like it's pretty easy to get better at like drawing faces when you haven't done it ever. And then you spend a month doing it intensively. There's so many things you can get better. It's a lot harder to get better as a portrait artist if you've done it for 20 years. But I also find for writing, I think there's a couple things that make it harder to get better at. One is that it's a very ill-defined skill. So what does it even mean to be better at writing? And we could get into that. I know you probably feel that for writing. I think, there's some things that I worked on in this book that I think make the writing better than the last book. But of course, someone could read the last book and they're like, well, I liked those things that you improved from the new one. So there is a real, I would say a real measurement problem that like getting better. I mean, I don't go too philosophical in the book, but we could really get philosophical. Like, what does it mean to get better?
Yes.
What is better? And, so that's one thing. And then the second thing is that because I write so much, like I've written like, it's getting close to 1,700 essays on my website. I've probably written like there's about 10 books, 11 books worth of material at least on the website. And, it goes back to our practice point. Like I've definitely put in my 10,000 hours in writing, but, I can see people who are better than me. And why? Why do I see people who are better than me? Well, because when I write my weekly essay, I'm increasingly ingraining a habit of doing things. Like this is what's comfortable for me. This is what comes automatically. And every once in a while, someone will point out, yeah, but that's not the best way to do it. Or you're doing this and that's kind of like not so good. And so part of getting better and like to go sort of what's the secret for getting better, I found that like if you can have a project that has constraints which force you to do something in not the way that feels most automatic, that is a good way to move forward in your skill when you've had a lot of practice and you've reached the phase that I've had where you've done it too much. It's not the issue that you don't have enough practice, but you've done it too much and you're not getting any better at it. And so for me with this book, for instance, I set particular constraints I wanted to have on my writing, on my thinking, that it was like, I like these qualities in other writers. I want to try to do it myself. Now, we can again go into the like, is that actually better? Or is that, lateral move or a different style? Those are good points. But that process, I think, is necessary if you want to do something differently, if you don't want to just fall into your old habits, if you want to produce work that, forget better, it's at least different.
Right.
It requires you to select constraints that are going to force you out of that. So if you're a hunting and pecking kind of person on the keyboard and you want to do touch typing, you need something that's going to force you to do that. So you need the paper that's taped over the keyboard and you're like, I can only have my fingers on the home rows and I'm not allowed to look at the keys. And I'm going to make lots of mistakes for a week or two, but eventually I'm going to learn a new way of typing because otherwise you're just going to go back to that default every time because it's more convenient.
Right. Well, and you also be willing to decide. Like I pointed out in the chat that I took typing class in high school and I do not touch type, but I type really quickly.
Okay, yeah.
Which I know. So the look at like, really, I'm like, yes, I can type really well without, I'm not hunting and pecking, but I definitely don't. And I've tried to get back to that. I have a mechanical key, I have touch type, and it's just like, you know what? It's almost like, and I think this is a really good kind of thing we can get into, is you have to be willing to commit to it fully, I think. And for me, it's again, that idea of the diminishing aspect. I'm like, it's good enough. Like for me, that typing is good enough. And the more I do it, the better I am at the way that I do it, which I think is, but there are so many other things that I should be focusing on getting better at. So it's like the whole David Allen quote of like, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. Like that's got to fall into this. That's why the book's not called Get Better at Everything.
I mean, you stole the words right out of my mouth. I mean, we could spend a whole episode just dissecting the 4 words of the title of the book. Like, what does it mean to get better and anything? But I mean, it's exactly that point. I've been having podcast conversations with people. They're like, well, what if I don't want to get better at something? And it's like, yes, of course. 99.99% of things you are not going to actively get better at. And like, that's just because especially for things like you were saying with the touch typing. I have a chapter about that too. I have a chapter about unlearning, and this process of like well-honed skills are very difficult to change, and they frequently don't pass the cost benefit threshold. That is one reason why I would suggest, like, if my son who doesn't type right now, if he's going to start typing, I would be like, okay, let's do a typing class first, because I don't know your method. Maybe you have some ad hoc brilliant method for typing, but definitely when you compare the 2-finger versus the whole hand is faster in the limit with practice.
I am using 4. I use all 4 except the thumbs. Like the thumbs don't play a role in it at all. Even the space bar would be easy to, but it just doesn't work. And actually,
I'm very much space bar with the thumbs.
But you know what's interesting is, so when we had a fire a number of years ago, and it was a kitchen fire. And I put it out. Everything was fine, except I got, and you can't really see, but I've got like scar tissue here on my, because I grabbed the pot and I had a towel, but there was enough exposed that the metal hit my, so for a long time, I couldn't, like for a while, and I'm left-handed, so it was, I mean, that was good, but I couldn't use, like, I actually, the doctor was like, here are the pain meds. I'm like, well, it's not really sore. I'm like, it will be. And I'm like, oh, like as it heals? And they go, no, because if you don't start being able to do this, then we're going to have to do some skin grafting. Tissue. They would have to skin. They go, that's what's going to hurt is you. And so, but because I never used my thumbs so it never affected that. Like, and so it was almost like it was serendipitous that I had never, I mean, and I was doing other things too. I embraced dictation more, all that stuff. But like I definitely don't hunt and peck, but it is some weird ad hoc way. And to your point, like the idea of improving on something, it's about choice, right? Like what do I want to give and Lisa brings this up. She says, this is like about the idea of hitting a plateau in sports training, where you hit a plateau and need a challenge to help you get over that. Like when you've kind of hit that threshold. And to me, it's interesting. Now I want to talk about 2 more things before we wrap up, because I want to be respectful of time. I've been reading, recently the book Noise. The Kahneman's last book.
I've read it.
So what, and which is fascinating read, because we all talk about bias, but the noise factor, no one really talks about that much. So would you I'd love to hear your thoughts on the effects of bias. You could probably touch on pretty easily, but the idea of noise when you're trying to get better at anything, how do you either what's the role? How do you circumvent it if it needs to be circumvented? Can it be an aid?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. There's lots of places where randomness and noise and unpredictability factor into the learning process. I mean, we were talking about variability as it plays to learning skills, that like learning in a variable environment can result in improved skills in some ways, because the lack of predictability forces you to learn things that you don't in a more regular environment. But there's limits to that. And so I don't want to go on the other board and say that, like, well, make it as chaotic and crazy as possible, and then you're going to be an expert. That's definitely not what the research says. I will definitely underscore that in this conversation. I try to lay out some very clear mental models for understanding when it's not helpful. But one of the things that I found really interesting doing the research is that there's been, starting in the 1980s, there was a lot of research. Everything starts in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a lot of research on expert-novice differences. So this was an area of study where you look at people who are like physicists versus, undergrad physics students, or chess grandmasters versus novice players, or differences between the people who are the best and the people who are just starting out in many domains. And there was all these psychological experiments studying, what do the experts do differently? And there was all these regularities found. And I think these were very important studies for understanding like what we were talking about, but like what changes, what is happening when you learn a skill? What is the brain doing? These were very important theoretical work that was done. And sort of in parallel to that, there was a body of research. I mean, Daniel Kahneman was one of the contributors to it, but I talk about some of the other figures as well, that was looking at expertise in different domains and finding out that, well, experts aren't even that good. So the example I think about is there was this book that was published that was on the difference between what was called clinical and actuarial or statistical reasoning. And so this psychologist, Paul Meehl, was looking at studies where you have the opportunity for expert judgment, and you can compare that to a fairly brain-dead method. So the brain-dead method would be like a tally of pros and cons. Or it could be a little bit more sophisticated, that it could be like a weighted tally. So like certain factors are more important than others. That's also called like a linear regression, if we want to be technical about it. But basically it was like PhD holding expert who has decades of experience versus Excel, right? This is what we're comparing. And he wrote this book in the 1950s, and he was sort of noting that, well, there'd been several studies done, and the statistical algorithm, the Excel spreadsheet, actually tended to do better in more cases. It was like the weight of evidence was sort of looking at like, well, it looks like the spreadsheet's actually doing better than experts. And he kind of was like, sort of, the case isn't closed yet. We're still doing research. And he was even speculating that, like, maybe there's going to be some situations where clinical judgment, where this sort of well-trained years of experience doing these judgment tasks would perform better. And the funny thing is that, like, after the decades, the research just kept mounting in the favor of the Excel sheet, that in a whole swath of tasks, and we're talking about judgment tasks here. We're talking about like making a decision, like, do you hire someone? Do you give someone parole? Do they have a particular mental disorder? Are they likely to have? So we're not talking about like painting a picture or something like that. We're talking about
and this ties in nicely to the book Noise, where they talk about judgment and all that stuff. So.
Exactly. Well, yeah, judges, for instance, in deciding cases is another example of this. And one of the things that they found in doing all this research, again, is that it was very hard to get situations where the experts outperform the tally. And even in the cases where they did about the same, the expert is usually someone who's like highly paid. They went to Harvard, whatever. Whereas the spreadsheet is something that, like, I mean, you could just get a computer program to do it. It's very, very cost. So it's like, even when it would maybe be about the same, it's more cost effective to do the spreadsheet. And so there was this real contrast, because I'm reading these literature, and then there's the marvel of like how good chess players are, and physicists, and all these people who have this, like, clearly, even to this day, we can't write computer programs that can substitute mathematicians or substitute physicists. I mean, they're working on it, but we're not there yet. And yet we're talking about much, much more basic systems, like you can write them in Excel, that are doing better. So what's the difference? And the difference is that when you are learning in an environment of noise, so there's an uncertain environment. So when you hire someone, there's a certain randomness. You're never going to get to a point where you just know 100% this person is going to succeed at my company, or they're going to be a failure. You're just making a guess. You're making a prediction. So it's a noisy, uncertain environment. And there's a lot of different pieces of information that could be predictive. So it's not just like people from Harvard are good, people who are not from Harvard are not good. Well, Harvard is one signal, but there's like dozens of others that you can get from their resume, from the interview, et cetera. What they found is that people are very bad at aggregating this predictive information when there's a lot of it. And they're particularly bad when they can't learn from calibrating feedback. So a contrasting example is something like poker, where there's lots of different situations, there's lots of variety, there's lots of noise, there's lots of different examples. But until very recently, the best poker players were better than computers. I mean, it took like supercomputer improvements to be able to beat really skilled poker players. And so the idea here is that if you want to get good in a domain where this kind of feedback is not automatic, basically, I think you have two choices. One choice is that you need to really improve the feedback of your environment. So I talk about Philip Tetlock's super forecasters, and how he went through this sort of training process to like make a better environment so that people could be better predictors of events in ways that like almost no one does in their career, in their office. This is not standard practice. Or the alternative is just accept that you're not going to have good intuitions about these things, and you need to rely more on models, and you need to rely more on like the spreadsheets and stuff like that. So to answer your rather long-winded point about answering about noise, I think that's a major factor, that if you're in a noisy environment, you really need to be taking steps to calibrate your feedback if you want to be genuinely good at what you're doing.
I've got one more question. It's the one probably a lot of people have been waiting for, and I think you know where I'm going with it as soon as I start. So Salman Khan just wrote a book that Brave New Words, How AI Will Revolutionize Education and Why That's a Good Thing. Now, I haven't read it yet. I've got it, but I haven't read it yet. So, people are thinking about AI. As we're recording this, ChatGPT came out with 4.0. Bard is now... So when people look at this, they're like, well, what is the role of AI? Generative, all the different forms. Because again, AI is, you can't paint it all with the same brush. Like I think a lot of people do. What role will that have in getting better at anything for people?
Yeah. So, I tend to think that AI has an important role to play. And I think that it opens up opportunities for things like the simplest example I can think of is that I did this language learning project about 10 years ago. And a lot of the things that we were dealing with that were difficulties, like, I want to watch this show, but there's no subtitles. And so it's too difficult for me to understand, but I don't have any way of checking it. Like these are all problems that are essentially fixed now.
Right.
So, it would be very interesting to do, again, some of these projects that were a little bit off the wall of my early 20s with this new technology. So I do think it's going to be a tool. I do think it's going to change things. It's certainly going to change classroom practice, if only from the fact that like now you can get a computer to write an essay for you, and people are no longer going to assume that just because the essay is handed in that you actually know anything that you're talking about. But I also tend to be a little bit more on the skeptic side of things, in that, there's a lot of brave pronouncements that we are entering a world where no one's going to have to learn anything anymore. Machines are going to do all the work. We, people like you and I, we might as well just quit now, because there's going to be deep fakes of our content, and like, why do we even need to write things? I just think that's nonsense. I think that what we're going to see with AI is very similar to what we see with all technology, that it's going to be a tool. It's going to enhance some things. It's going to make other things harder. And it's going to be something that people adapt to. So I definitely feel like the distribution of skills is going to shift. I definitely wouldn't want to be getting a career as a translator today. Like I wouldn't want to be going into that field. I would probably not want to be going into the field of just like someone who's just making DeviantArt, digital art right now. That's probably not a field that I would want to be going into, because all of a sudden you're facing this like extreme competition. You don't need to be an artist to generate ideas. You don't need to be a writer to generate, first drafts of things. But that being said, I really think the future is going to be people learning to work with this tool the same way that they learn to work with the internet, the same way that they learn to work with email, the same way they learn to work with all of these things. And so the actual eventual, is Sal Khan right? And we're all going to have little conmigos giving us advice in the classroom? I don't know. But I think that the basic principles of learning, the basic principles of getting good at things, mastering your craft, I don't think those are going to change, and I don't think they're going to change in our lifetime. And so that's my prediction that I'm going to make on that.
Scott, this has been a great conversation. Thanks to everybody who joined in the live stream. We've got some great questions there. Thanks. If you didn't join the live stream, you're listening to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Scott, where can people pick up the book, and where can people keep up with the work that you're doing?
Sure. So, the book Get Better at Anything, or my previous book, Ultra Learning, you can get them on Amazon, on Audible. You can, I think they even have them on Spotify now. So you can get it anywhere you get your books. And check out my website, scotthyoung.com. I've been writing for, almost 2 decades. So there's a lot of stuff there about productivity, about learning, about motivation and psychology. So I hope you find something interesting. If you've listened this far, then probably you will.
Scott, thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Big thanks to Scott for joining me once again, kind of at the last minute for this conversation. You can learn about his book and everything that we discussed at productivityist.com/podcast529. Don't forget to pick up his new book, Get Better at Anything. And again, if you want to check out the previous conversation, that's in the show notes as well. By the way, if you want to support the show and make sure that you don't miss anything that's to come, including other episodes that are from the archives, you can join us by subscribing to the show. That's one way to support it, of course. You can do that wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, wherever you get your podcasts, even YouTube. Another way to support the show is to check out the sponsors, the ones you heard during our conversation today. That's another way to support the show. You just go to productivityist.com/podcast sponsors and you can check them out there. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for taking the time. We'll be back with a shiny new episode 530 coming up. Looking forward to delivering that to you next week. But until then, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.